Right now, approximately 4.5 billion people on Earth pray. Some do it in cathedrals with stained glass and organ music. Some do it silently at kitchen tables before eating. Some do it in mosques at precise times 5 times a day. Some do it in languages no longer spoken anywhere else on Earth. The rituals look completely different. The theologies contradict each other. But underneath all of that, the behavior is identical. A human being, alone or with others, directs words or thoughts towards something that cannot respond. And here is the strange part. Prayer works, not the way people think it works. Prayers are not statistically correlated with divine intervention. Studies designed to test whether God responds to requests have repeatedly failed to find evidence. The outcome of surgery does not improve when strangers pray for a patient without their knowledge. Crop failure does not respond to intercession. Disease does not accelerate its retreat because someone asked. But something else happens. Something measurable. Something that has been happening in the human brain for far longer than any religion has existed. That is the thing nobody talks about. Because the question was never whether prayer reaches something outside the human mind. The question was what prayer does to the mind that produces it. And the answer changes everything you thought you understood about why humans pray at all. To understand where prayer came from, you have to go back to a problem the human brain faced long before temples, long before priests, long before words like God existed in any language. The problem was stress. Not the modern kind, not traffic or deadlines or an awkward email you forgot to send. Ancient stress was immediate, physical, and potentially fatal. You were being chased. Someone in the group was injured. The food supply was disappearing. The worst outcome was not a bad day. It was death, or watching people you depended on die. The human stress response is one of the most sophisticated emergency systems ever built by evolution. When the brain detects threat, the hypothalamus fires a signal to the adrenal glands. Within seconds, cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. Heart rate increases, pupils dilate, digestion shuts down, blood flows to muscles. The brain narrows its focus to immediate survival. This response saved lives for hundreds of thousands of years. It still does. But it has one serious design flaw. It never fully turns off. Unlike most animals, humans can sustain the stress response using nothing but thought. A deer startled by a branch returns to grazing within minutes once the threat is gone. A human can spend 3 hours lying awake replaying a confrontation from 6 months ago. The brain that could outthink every predator also became the first brain capable of worrying about things that had not happened yet. And for ancient humans, that meant the stress response was almost never fully quiet. Something had to manage it. Here is where things get complicated, because the brain did not solve this problem by developing the capacity for prayer directly. It solved it by developing something else entirely, something that existed for purely practical reasons. And prayer turned out to be the side effect. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, language, and abstract thought, developed a remarkable ability. It could narrate. It could take the chaotic flood of fear, threat, and uncertainty and convert it into a story, a sequence with a beginning, a middle, and some version of an end. This mattered enormously. Narrative structure allows the brain to place a threat in a container. Once a threat has a shape, an origin, and a potential resolution, the brain processes it differently. The amygdala, the region that fires the alarm, begins to quiet. Cortisol starts to drop. The body begins to believe at a chemical level that the situation is being handled. This is not metaphor. This is measurable neurobiology. When humans began speaking, this capacity became dramatically more powerful. A frightened hunter who could say, "The lion came from the north. It is gone now. We are safe," was calming not just his own nervous system, but the nervous systems of everyone listening. Shared narrative created shared physiological regulation. The group's stress response synchronized and then settled together. Now extend that forward. A child dies. A drought arrives. Someone is badly injured with no way to predict whether they will survive. These are threats with no immediate solution. The brain still needs to narrate them. It still needs to place them in a container. But the container requires something the physical world cannot always provide. It requires a listener. That is the mechanism. And once you understand it, prayer becomes obvious. Talking to something that cannot respond is not irrational. It is one of the most efficient ways the human brain has ever found to activate the neural pathways associated with being heard, being understood, and no longer being alone with an unbearable situation. The prefrontal cortex does not distinguish cleanly between an imagined listener and a real one when it comes to the physiological effects of narrating distress. What matters to the stress response is the act of externalization, the movement of internal chaos into structured language directed outward. This sounds like philosophy. It is not. In 2003, neuroscientist Andrew Newberg at Thomas Jefferson University used brain imaging to study Franciscan nuns during prayer. The prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for focused attention and language, showed significantly increased activity. At the same time, the parietal lobes, the regions responsible for the sense of being a separate, bounded self, showed decreased activity. The nuns were not imagining this experience. Their brains were measurably changing. The sense of being alone, of being a single isolated organism facing an impossible situation, was diminishing at a neurological level. The stress architecture that ancient humans developed to manage threat was activating, and then, through the act of narrated prayer, beginning to resolve. Newberg called this the orientation response. The brain was reorienting its sense of self in relation to something larger. And when the boundary between self and situation begins to dissolve, the threat contained within that self becomes, briefly, smaller. This is what prayer does, not to the universe, to the brain that produces it. The brain did not develop language to create prayer. It developed language to survive. It developed narrative to manage threat. It developed the impulse to externalize distress to regulate a stress response that could not safely remain fully activated. Prayer was the side effect, and once it appeared, it was a remarkably effective one. Because prayer does something else that purely internal processing cannot. It creates a sense of witness. The human brain is exquisitely sensitive to whether it is being observed, understood, or accompanied. Loneliness is not just an emotional experience. Studies by University of Chicago psychologist John Cacioppo demonstrated that chronic loneliness produces the same inflammatory markers in the body as chronic physical stress. The brain treats social isolation as a physiological threat. Prayer addresses this directly. The person praying is not alone. They are within their own neural architecture, in the presence of something that knows them completely, that has always known them, that is not going anywhere. That perception, regardless of its theological accuracy, produces a genuine reduction in the biological markers of isolation. The ritual itself also matters. Repetition is not accidental in prayer traditions. Kneeling, folding hands, facing a direction, repeating specific words, these behaviors activate what neuroscientists call procedural memory, the same deeply encoded system that allows humans to perform complex physical tasks without conscious effort. Procedural memory is calming. It tells the brain that this situation has been encountered before, that there is an established response, that the path is known. For an ancient human who had no explanation for lightning, plague, or the death of a child, entering a practiced, familiar ritual was one of the only available ways to tell the nervous system, "We have been here before. We survived." The brain did not develop the stress response in order to create religion. It developed it to survive. It did not develop narrative in order to create theology. It developed it to process threat. It did not develop the need for witness in order to generate faith. It developed all of these things to keep a fragile primate alive in a dangerous world. Prayer was what happened when those three systems combined, and it spread across every human culture that has ever existed, not because any single tradition taught it to the others, but because every human brain, anywhere, in any century, eventually faces situations it cannot resolve, cannot predict, and cannot bear to face entirely alone. Not one culture has ever been documented without some form of directed address to something larger than the self. Not one. That is not coincidence. That is anatomy. The next time you find yourself, in some quiet moment of genuine distress, forming words that are not really addressed to anyone visible, pause for a second. That is not faith or its absence. That is not superstition. That is a 300,000-year-old stress management system activating exactly as designed. Your prefrontal cortex is trying to narrate an unbearable situation into something containable. Your nervous system is trying to locate a witness so it does not have to carry the weight entirely alone. You are doing what every human before you has done, in every culture, on every continent, under every kind of sky. The words are yours. The need that produces them is ancient, and somewhere in the neurological machinery of that act, something real is happening, just not where anyone expected to find it.